Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty fascinating Machiavellian playbook for complex business negotiations. The source material outlines 8 distinct traits of what it calls dark intelligence. Now, don't let the name fool you. This isn't some toolkit for manipulating people. It's actually a framework to help you understand deep power dynamics and, more importantly, protect yourself at the negotiating table. Let's break down exactly what these 8 traits are and how to apply them to high-stakes corporate environments. And as we go through this, keep this in mind. Appliquez ces 8 traits aux négociations d'affaires complexes. Apply these 8 traits to complex business negotiations.
To set the tone right out of the gate, the playbook hits us with this classic quote from Niccolo Machiavelli: "Never was anything great achieved without danger." It's basically arguing that the highest levels of the business world, they rarely play completely fair. The framework suggests that no matter how honest or competent you are, you're inevitably going to face intense power struggles and hidden agendas. Recognizing this inherent danger, rather than just ignoring it, is framed as the literal first step to achieving great things.
Okay, let's dive right into the outline. We've got 6 main sections covering these 8 key traits: the reality of negotiations, opacity and strategic image, the power of silent leverage, adapting and understanding others, detachment and outcome obsession, and finally, the ethics of negotiation. Now pay super close attention to Section 3. Mettez l'accent sur le levier silencieux. Put the emphasis on silent leverage. The source highlights this concept as the absolute core and ultimate secret weapon for dealmakers, so we're definitely going to spend some extra time unpacking that.
Starting off with Section 1, the reality of negotiations.
So the text kicks things off by defining this concept of dark intelligence. It suggests that this strategic mindset is actually often born from past defeats or those really tough professional humiliations, using those hard-earned lessons strictly for protection. And this brings us to the very first trait, strategic calculation. The source sharply contrasts an amateur negotiator with a strategic one. While an amateur might totally drown in their emotions, react impulsively, and just talk endlessly to fill uncomfortable silence, the strategic negotiator treats the whole interaction like a giant game of chess. They listen, they calculate, they gather information quietly. The playbook really emphasizes that making a conscious choice to actively observe rather than emotionally reacting to provocations is the absolute foundation of high-level negotiation.
Moving right along to Section 2, opacity and strategic image. Here we run into the second trait, which is calculated opacity. The framework suggests a highly counterintuitive approach here. In business, there's this really common assumption that total transparency is always the best way to build trust. But the text argues that oversharing actually just gives away your strategic power. Think about it. If you explain every single detail of your operations, you become entirely predictable. Instead, the strategy advocates for calculated opacity. By offering a vague but perfectly truthful statement, like simply saying you have something important to take care of, rather than exactly what you're doing, you maintain this kind of curiosity gap. This gap, according to the source, naturally generates mystery and influence, letting you completely control the narrative without ever resorting to deceit.
Which logically leads us to the third trait, controlled exposure. The strategy strongly advises against laying all your cards on the table at once. For example, imagine you're walking into a complex vendor negotiation. If you immediately reveal your total budget constraints and maximum production capacity during the very first introductory meeting, the counterpart instantly knows exactly where your ceiling is. The playbook recommends revealing information and capabilities very gradually over a series of meetings. By deliberately withholding your full hand and managing exposure over time, you keep the other party guessing, and that fundamentally protects your long-term strategic advantage.
All right, Section 3, the power of silent leverage.
This brings us to the absolute core focus of the source material, and the fourth trait, silent leverage. The text defines this as the art of creating massive influence without uttering a single word. It posits that amateurs fundamentally misunderstand power. They tend to think power has to be loud, right? That you have to pound your fist on the boardroom table or aggressively demand respect to get your way. But the framework argues that real, enduring power actually whispers. It's about positioning yourself so intelligently that your mere presence alters the entire dynamic of the room. Instead of forcing a counterpart to agree through attrition, silent leverage shifts the psychological weight so heavily that the other party naturally chooses the path that benefits you. It's basically winning the power struggle while appearing completely disengaged from it.
The playbook outlines a highly specific 3-step tactical approach to applying this silent leverage in the real world.
First, when you're asked a high-stakes or exceptionally difficult question, the natural human instinct is to immediately fill the void and start defending your position. Well, the text advises aggressively overriding that instinct and deliberately pausing. Step 2, let that awkward silence stretch for several uncomfortable seconds. According to the psychological principles cited in the source, most people absolutely despise dead air and will inevitably start talking just to fill it. And when they do, they very often ramble and accidentally reveal their hidden motives or absolute bottom lines. Finally, step 3 happens when you do eventually answer. Because of that strategic pause, the words you deliver carry a significantly changed, almost undeniable gravity.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the source applies silent leverage across different business contexts. At the negotiating table, silence often takes the physical form of what they call the unmentioned alternative. For instance, if a corporate buyer sits down intimately knowing they have a fully vetted secondary supplier ready to sign a contract, they don't necessarily need to aggressively threaten the primary supplier with that fact. Just knowing they possess a viable alternative creates this relaxed, unbothered posture that naturally alters the interpersonal dynamic. The text notes that this delayed gratification, the immense discipline required to sit quietly with your backup plans rather than aggressively flaunting them, grants you a level of power that is almost invisible to the untrained eye.
Moving on to Section 4, Adapting and Understanding Others.
Here we uncover the 5th trait, which is adaptive communication. The author stresses the absolute necessity of studying the person sitting across from you. As outlined in the source, a master negotiator is completely fluid in their presentation style, while keeping their core values totally intact. If you're facing a highly analytical counterpart, the framework suggests leaning heavily into facts, raw data, and spreadsheets. On the flip side, if you're dealing with an emotional, visionary leader, your approach shifts to connecting with their broader feelings and long-term goals. And for a strictly practical counterpart, you shift to a mechanical breakdown of how things actually work. The key takeaway here isn't to be fake. It's to tactically adjust your communication frequency so it perfectly matches their wavelength, without ever altering the underlying substance of your offer. Going a layer deeper into communication, the text introduces the 6th trait, the psychological echo. The source argues that subconsciously, every CEO, vendor, or investor you speak with is continuously asking 3 silent questions during a negotiation. Do you see me? Do you understand me? And do you value me? Rather than constantly pitching a product or fiercely arguing a point, the playbook suggests that tactically reflecting back their deep-seated needs answers these questions with a resounding yes. For example, explicitly summarizing a counterpart's operational fears before presenting your proposed solution makes them feel profoundly seen and understood. The material argues that intentionally answering these 3 silent questions is quite literally one of the fastest, most effective strategies to build massive trust in a complex deal.
Which brings us to Section 5, Detachment and Outcome Obsession.
This leads directly into our 7th trait. Now, the source is very clear here. Detachment shouldn't be mistaken for coldness or apathy. Rather, it defines the concept as absolute freedom from the fear of loss. The text asks us to consider 2 distinct profiles at a negotiating table. Person A absolutely needs the deal to survive. They're desperate and highly emotionally attached to the final outcome. Person B, on the other hand, has carefully cultivated other options and is genuinely willing to walk away if the terms aren't right. So who holds the power here? The framework argues that person A's desperation inherently weakens their position and makes them easily manipulated. Conversely, person B's detachment grants them total leverage. According to the source, the most dangerous person in any room is always the one who realistically has nothing to lose.
Building on this sense of detachment, the text draws a really sharp contrast between ego-driven amateurs and outcome-obsessed professionals. The playbook suggests that an amateur, guided largely by their ego, will often fight tirelessly for hours over some minor contract detail just for the sake of winning the argument and feeling validated. A professional, however, is solely focused on actual, tangible results. The strategy notes that a highly detached professional will gladly concede a petty debate or even let the counterpart feel like the smartest person in the room, as long as that strategic concession moves the needle closer to signing the contract and securing the overarching business objective.
This ruthless focus on efficiency brings us to the 8th and final trait outlined in the text, strategic laziness. This is essentially the direct application of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, to complex negotiations. The source recommends focusing 100% of your cognitive energy purely on the 20% of activities that actually produce 80% of the results. For example, instead of spending weeks over-preparing anxious responses to every single minor hypothetical question, a strategic negotiator focuses entirely on mastering the core leverage points and their alternatives. The text notes that these elite professionals often appear to be doing less work, but that's simply because they categorically refuse to confuse busy work with actual accomplishment.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the ethics of negotiation.
So the crucial point here is how the text addresses the ethical boundaries of applying this entire framework. It explores what Machiavelli might call ambiguous morality. The playbook argues that the stark realities of the business world are rarely ever black and white. It suggests that employing pragmatic ethics, like prioritizing the long-term health and survival of a company over short-term politeness, is sometimes absolutely necessary. According to the source, true kindness and ethical leadership in complex corporate environments frequently require delivering harsh truths or making very difficult, drastic choices in order to protect the greater good of the organization and its people.
But the playbook draws a very strict ethical line regarding the use of this dark intelligence. It explicitly states that the goal is not to become a manipulator, but rather to become someone who absolutely cannot be manipulated. The source advocates that traits like calculated opacity, the psychological echo, and silent leverage are intended to be utilized purely as shields. They are not weapons to actively hurt innocent parties. The ultimate intention behind mastering these 8 concepts is to prevent malicious actors from exploiting you, allowing you to safely navigate hostile corporate environments and secure sustainable win-win outcomes.
Ultimately, this playbook argues that a deep, calculated understanding of human psychology holds immense strategic power at the negotiating table. The source leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought regarding these 8 traits. Armed with the knowledge of how to properly utilize silent leverage and strategic opacity, it asks, will you choose to become the most dangerous person in the room to your competitors, or the most profoundly valuable asset to the allies who know how to work with you? The material suggests that choice is entirely up to you.